Hello, my friends, and welcome to End of Life University Podcast, where we share real talk about life and death. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me here for episode number 331. This is the last episode of 2021, so I'm glad you're here with me. I'm going to do a little bit of a look ahead at next year and reflecting a little bit on the past year that we've just experienced. And it's at this time of year that I always stop and reflect on what it is I'm doing and ask myself if there are changes I need to make for the future. So it always tends to be a time when I reevaluate this podcast and decide, should I keep doing it or not? Because I know that at some point everything will change and I will probably decide that it's time to end the podcast. But for this year, as I contemplated that, it happens that I got a couple of messages in a row from people who are listeners, Jeannie and Tamar, who wrote to me to say, thank you so much for all you're doing. And it's funny how every time I consider stopping the podcast, I get a message from somewhere that says, oh, no, this is really important. This is valuable. And that spurs me on to keep going. And in addition, I got some new supporters on my page at Patreon. Terry A. Portugal Gooden and Carrie Zlotnick and Brittany Ellis increased her pledge each month. So those are just little nuggets of encouragement and support for me that remind me that people are listening and appreciating what I'm putting out into the world. So I want to thank my new supporters, Terry and Carrie. Thank you, Brittany, for increasing your pledge. Thank you, Jeannie and Tamar, for emailing me. And I'll let all of you know I'm happy anytime to receive messages from you by email, through Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, any way that you choose to reach out to me. I'm so happy to get your messages, and I will try to share those more often on the podcast. So I'm grateful for all of your support, everyone who's been listening, everyone who's been making pledges on my page at patreon.com/EOLU. And I can't tell you how much that means to me. And yes, I'm going to continue this podcast into the new year, and I feel excited and refreshed to do that. I am recording this a little bit early, however, because I'm planning to take the last week of the year off as a little break. So that's my self-care here over the holidays. So I will be back in the new year with new interviews and episodes for you. And let's close out this year with a little look back at this year and ahead to 2022. So one of the bonuses, which if you're not one of my Patreon followers, you may not know about this. One thing I do every month is compile the latest news in the end of life arena into a little summary audio for my Patreon supporters. So I tend to keep up with new things that are happening out there. And I get a lot of encouragement actually from seeing how much movement and growth there is in this end of life space in many different areas. So I've kind of divided up some of the things that are happening in the world right now in order to talk about what new things might be coming in the future and some of the new things that have occurred over the past year. So the first category I want to look at is advanced care planning. And I've been reading articles stating that more Americans than ever before have completed their advanced healthcare directives. So this has been new since the pandemic. A lot of people have been inspired to sit down and do some planning for the end of life. And even financial planners are reporting that more people than ever before have completed wills and estate plans for the future. So there's been an awakening around the end of life and the importance of planning ahead for the end of life. And that's something good that has happened because of the pandemic. And I expect that to continue. I expect that in 2022, we will see even more people preparing advanced directives, but I believe we will also see more innovation around advanced care planning. And this year, in episode 283, I did an interview about Mideo, which is an online app for recording your end-of-life wishes on video, which I think is a new trend that I think will continue and only grow, and I expect to see more technology like this in the coming year. And one thing that I believe will help foster even more growth around advanced care planning is end-of-life education. And in episode 300 in the past year, I interviewed Michelle Pante and Rena Lazar about their EOL Educators program, which is an online program where you can get all the tools you need to become an end-of-life educator, which again, I've been emphasizing this for several years now, but I think education is the key. If we want to change the way we approach the end of life in our society, we have to have more education. We need to educate the public and let them know about death doulas, about the importance of end-of-life planning, about hospice and palliative care, about alternative funeral and burial arrangements, all of those things. We need as much education as possible. So check out episode number 300 if you want to learn more about that. Also, technology has been big in end-of-life news during this last year. Again, spurred on by COVID, because COVID made it more difficult for people to have in-person, face-to-face visits with their medical doctor. We moved on to telemedicine, which is something that's been present but sputtering for several years, but suddenly took off in the past year. We're seeing more capability for remote monitoring of patients, which is allowing more seniors to age in place in their own homes. And many different innovations are in process right now for various types of telemedicine, but also other types of apps. There are apps for helping seniors age in place and for helping families to stay in touch with their relatives for whom they are separated. So there's a lot on the scene that's happening right now and things that will be coming in the future. In episode number 313, I interviewed Reed Peterson about the Grief Refuge app, which is an app to support people who are grieving. And so I expect even more of this to be coming along in the next year. In addition, in the last year, in many of the articles I read and the studies I read, we have seen an increased embrace of palliative care in the healthcare profession. So hospitals, clinics, referring physicians, people are waking up to the value of palliative care. Many studies have been done showing that it improves quality of life for patients. And in episode 325, I interviewed Dr. John Mulder about palliative care. We had a great conversation. I encourage you to go back and listen to that if you didn't hear it. But also, along with embracing palliative care and then hospice as well, we see end-of-life care expanding in other ways and people focusing on other groups. There's been a lot of attention paid to health disparities at the end of life. Quinn Galloway in episode number 324 talked about end-of-life care specifically for veterans. And Dr. Nahid Dosani in episode 288 and Penny Davis in episode 306 talked about caring for the homeless and how to offer palliative care to people who are unhoused. So palliative care in general is expanding in acceptance and also broadening the spectrum of people we're focusing on to receive palliative care and also hospice care. And this is a fantastic development. I expect to see a much bigger push forward for palliative care next year. So this is an exciting development. One of the things that Dr. John Mulder and I talked about is the fact that referring patients to palliative care can actually help physicians with burnout because they're getting assistance from an entire team of people who can help meet the emotional needs of their patients. And this takes a certain amount of burden away from the doctors. Also, the palliative care team is really good. There's like an osmosis that occurs with physicians when they come in contact with the palliative care team, who begin to understand end-of-life issues a little bit better. So the more palliative care expands, the more our end-of-life care in general is expected to improve over time. On the subject of burnout, I did an interview number 285 with Janet Carroll, who is a laughter yoga teacher, and we talked a lot about the benefits of laughter for helping with burnout and compassion fatigue. Also, a number of talks on various types of arts to help with self-care. Poetry. Bruce Sterling in episode 287 talked about his use of poetry for grief. Ben Kintish in episode 292 shared his hospice musical with us, which was really amazing and delightful to listen to. Suzanne O'Brien in episode 323 talked about self-care. This was one of the more popular episodes this year, so I encourage you to go back and listen to that if you need some reminders about taking better care of ourselves as we're caring for others. Along the same lines, we had some conversations about the importance of stories. And Tim Robbins shared Echo Box in episode 289, which allows people to record their stories as a legacy for their loved ones. This is another innovative use of technology. I did an episode on the hero's journey, which is the story structure that is most commonly used in all stories throughout the world right now, in episode 284, and then also how to use stories for teaching purposes in episode number 318. So if you're interested in the use of stories, go back and check out those episodes. Another really positive development is a rise in interest in psilocybin therapy for patients at the end of life, which helps with the fear of death, helps with pain and anxiety management. And Catherine Tucker did an excellent interview with me, episode number 295, talking about the legal aspects of getting psilocybin therapy legalized in our country and how she is working on these cases. So we should, in the future, see even more use of psilocybin, which I think will be a wonderful development. Next, we are paying a lot more attention and being more accepting of near-death experiences and other phenomena. Much more information is coming to the surface, more studies, more books are being written, more people are talking about these experiences. In episode 296, I did an interview with Scott Jansen about near-death experiences. In episode 301, I talked with Joshua Black about grief dreams, people who have dreams that are helpful with their grief, perhaps a visitation from a loved one or seeing a loved one in a dream. In episode 303, I talked to Judy Hilliard, who is a soul companion for the dying, who has these out-of-body experiences where she accompanies someone who's dying across the veil. Very fascinating. And in episode number 329, which just very recently aired, William Peters shared his research on shared death experiences. Fascinating, and he has a new book coming out in just a few weeks, and we'll be reading that book in a year of Reading Dangerously, and also doing a Q&A session with William on the book at the end of March. So sign up for a year of Reading Dangerously, my online reading group, if you'd like to read that book with our group and then take part in the Q&A session. Next, there's been a lot of disruption in the funeral industry, which is a very good thing. In episode number 291, I talked with Eric Layer about restoring the funeral business, and he presented a really interesting topic and also a book about how the funeral industry itself needs to change, the traditional funeral industry, which doesn't necessarily need to go away, but it needs to evolve and change. And that was a really interesting and helpful interview. And then I talked with Marilyn Rush in episode 294 about virtual funerals and memorials. I highly recommend this interview. This again touches on the use of technology for funerals and memorials, but Marilyn's conversation was so helpful because she tells us how she herself planned a virtual funeral service for one of her loved ones and how gratifying it was, how positive it was. She also gives a lot of tips on what to do and what not to do if you want to plan a similar event. There are some online companies coming on board who will help you plan a virtual funeral and help host it for you. But Mary Lynn talks about how to plan it yourself if you don't want to spend the money to have someone help you do it. This was such a helpful episode to me that, in fact, I've recommended it to my own family to say, someday when I die, just have a virtual funeral, because I know people everywhere, all over, who are never going to be able to travel to come to a funeral. Just have a virtual funeral, and here's how you do it. So that's episode 294. Then also I interviewed Kathy Benjamin about her book, It's Your Funeral, which is a great it's a really humorous read, but it's kind of a great step-by-step guidebook for planning your own funeral. That was episode number 317. And then finally, I interviewed people from Titan Caskets who talked about disrupting the casket industry. This is in episode 320, and ordering caskets online. So again, technology coming in and disrupting things and offering us new alternatives. So that's a really interesting subject as well for those who want to be buried in a casket, whether traditional or whether an alternative type of burial container. Take a listen to that interview, and you'll learn some new things that are happening there. Next, one of the topics of the year, I would say the last 2 years, is the subject of grief. And many people are saying we're in the midst of a tsunami of grief, a pandemic of grief itself, because over the last almost 2 years of COVID-19, there have been so many losses in so many areas, not just loss of life, but many other losses people have experienced. Many people are dealing with overwhelming, cumulative, and complicated grief right now. So that subject has come up over and over again in all the articles that I've been reading this past year. Some of the innovative programs people are implementing to try to help with grief. One hospice is doing an art installation project. They're having all of the families involved with their hospice and in their community submit art pieces that they're putting together into a collage, and they're going to house it in their chapel, somewhat like the AIDS quilt that developed many years ago for AIDS. There are many online grief groups forming since it's difficult for people to come together. Some of those are forming around specific types of grief that people are experiencing. And the online venue allows for that because you can draw people from all over the world, really, to come to one group that's focused rather narrowly. So it's interesting to see technology is providing us with new ways to grieve together. One of the interesting interviews I did was with Jennifer Matthews. This was episode number 298. Jennifer actually talked about loss without sadness, and that when we're considering grief and all of its uniqueness for every person, to remember that not all people are sad after a loss occurs. And she makes a compelling case for why we need to remember that, and we need to treat each person as they are, whatever their experience is. We need to validate and not expect that anyone is going to follow a particular path in their grieving. In episode 299, Oceana Sawyer talked with me about embodied grieving, which was really beautiful. Some of the rituals and practices that she does to experience grief in our bodies, which I think is really necessary in order for complete healing. And I was really inspired by Oceana's thoughts. Then Carl Shackelford in episode 304 talked about men's grief and the groups that he hosts just for men, because men grieve a little differently than women do, and it's important that we give men a place where they can feel safe expressing their emotions. Next, Francesca Arnoldi talked about children and grief and the book she's written, The Map of Memory Lane, which is beautiful. And finally, Chase Cassine, a social worker from New Orleans, in episode 326, shared his thoughts about grief and baking, how he has used baking to help him grieve the death of his mother and has continued. He loves baking, and he's made a cookbook called The Sweetest Therapy, and that's very inspiring. And then also I did an episode on the disenfranchised grief that has affected many people during this pandemic, and that was episode number 322. Finally, I wanted to mention an episode that was particularly impactful for me was a discussion I had with Kevin Hines on suicide. And Kevin is a person who attempted suicide by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived, and has now gone on to start the Be Here Tomorrow movement. He's visiting with people all over the world. He himself, by sharing his story, has saved many, many lives from ending in suicide. And Kevin's very inspiring. Our interview was shorter than I wanted it to be because he didn't have much time and we had some technical difficulties in the beginning, but that interview took place in episode 310. And for me, as most of you know who've listened for a while, my own father died by suicide many years ago, and I've struggled to really share the full story of my dad and his death. Though I talk about it a fair amount, I haven't necessarily always gone into depth about his death. And Kevin inspired me to put together a 2-hour workshop that I did earlier this year to discuss my father's suicide, what I learned about it, what I learned about suicide in general by studying my dad's life and the factors in his life that may have contributed to his death, even though I will never know exactly why he made that choice. But Kevin inspired me to have the courage to talk more about suicide and to overcome my fears of it being a taboo subject, my fears that no one would want to listen, and my fears also that what I said might be misunderstood or that I might invite judgment against my father. So I faced all of those fears and that discomfort, and I believe it was in September that I offered a workshop. I had a great attendance for it. Thank you to everyone who came for that workshop. That was very powerful for me to present it to you, and I will be repeating that in the future. And Suzanne O'Brien has invited me to do some teaching for her students in her Doula Givers program. So I'm very excited to be able to teach more about this topic and reflecting on my father's death by suicide and then my own grieving process following his death. So 2021 has been a challenging year. Still many, many losses for us to endure, much confusion, much unrest, much disruption, and probably for most of us, not a great sense of peace at the end of this year. But I believe that we have to always be able to hold our difficulties, our sorrow, and our pain, and at the same time hold on to the joy that life offers us. Even in the midst of our discomfort, there's always joy present. So I'm hoping that you've seen through what I've just been talking about, this look back at 2021 and looking ahead to the future, that there's much to be optimistic about. There's much to be joyful about. Don't lose sight of the joy and the light where it exists. Don't let the darkness of these days overpower the light and the love that resides within you, because by continuing to love, continuing to care, by continuing to bring our energies together, come together for the good, for the light, for what is positive in the world, we can continue to make change and move forward. And I believe these positive changes that have happened, even in the midst of a pandemic, are a good validation that that is the truth. We can continue to grow and continue to change even during the hardest times. So once again, thank you so much for listening in, for being my supporters and encouraging me to do this work that I'm doing. I'm grateful for all of you who've reached out to me and shared with me this past year. And I'm sending you all the love in my heart. I hope that you get to spend the end of this year with the people that you love and care about, whether in person, that you can be with them across the miles, virtually. I'm sending love to you out, waves and waves of love through the airwaves, and I hope you feel that. And remember to come back. In 2022, I'll still be here. I'll have more information to share with you. And until then, remember that we're here for love. So if you don't have time for anything else, just focus on love. That's all you need in your life right now. So face your fear. Be ready for whatever life brings us next in 2022. And just love each and every moment, each and every breath of your life. Bye-bye.